What is this a book about? It's a book about the central catastrophe in the history of the Western world, a catastrophe which embraces and includes and ends with, but is not limited to, the Holocaust. What I noticed as a historian of Eastern Europe in the past couple of decades, looking at the history of the region from the point of view of a number of languages, a number of perspectives, the history of a number of different countries and peoples, was that there was this black hole at the middle of everything, which despite all of our efforts and our various approaches and the important and impressive books upon which my own book is based and from which I've learned so much, we seem to have missed. And that is that over a very short period of time, about 12 years from 1933 to 1945, in a relatively small area, from the Baltic to the Black Sea, from roughly between Berlin and Moscow, or more precisely, between about Poznan and Smolensk, 14 million non-combatants were murdered. So aside and apart from the question of casualties of war, and by the way, in this zone, half of the casualties of war in the Second World War also fell. But aside and apart from that, 14 million people were killed. It struck me, and it still strikes me, that this is a figure worthy of some explanation. There's a question. How could it be? Why was it that 14 million people were killed in this time and in this place? And then there's a related question. What does this tell us about the two regimes that carried out the killing? Because this number is significant not only in absolute terms. I mean, I take it that 14 million as a number carries a certain weight. I don't have to emphasize that. But the number is also interesting in relative terms in the following way. If you look at the Nazi and the Soviet regimes side by side, if you look at all the territory that they controlled, which in, say, the year 1940 or 41 ranged from the Atlantic to the Pacific, they killed, during the period when Stalin and Hitler were both in power, about 17 million people total. Of that 17 million, 14 million were killed in this relatively small place that I call the Bloodlands. What's interesting about the Bloodlands is that it's really an overlay of three maps, and I guess this would be my cue for the map. There we go. That's very nice. If you look at this sort of terrible teardrop shape in the middle of Europe, what's interesting about this map is that it describes more or less perfectly three different areas. The overlap is almost perfect between three different conceptual geographies, and all three of them together are what I mean by the Bloodlands. First, this is the area where the Holocaust took place. Second, this is the area where all of those 14 million people were killed. And third, this is also the area, almost perfectly, where Soviet and German power overlapped. So it's quite striking to me that those three different ways of approaching the politics and the geography lead you to the same black zone. So the next thought is, given that you have this time and this place, and given that you can define it so precisely, and given that you have these interesting overlaps, why hasn't there been a history of this kind before? And I think the answers have to do with the limits within our own fields. In general, the way that the history of these tragedies, these related tragedies, is written is divided between those who work on East European history, those who work on Soviet history, and those who work on German history and the Holocaust. And that in itself is a problem. But within each of these schools of thought, or each of these fields, there are also problems. The East Europeanists tend to confine themselves to one nation or another. And you'll notice immediately that no national history can embrace the entirety of the Holocaust. The Holocaust crosses national boundaries. And this is true of a number of the other tragedies I'll be mentioning. When it comes to Soviet historians, there have been very important breakthroughs in the last 20 years, and this is worth emphasizing. In the last 20 years, we've had access to documents from Soviet and post-communist East European archives, which have allowed us to understand much more about the Soviet Union and communism than really we ever could have reasonably expected. And indeed, the access to these documents is more important than it might seem for the following reason. Once you notice that the Holocaust took place in this region, there's something else which defines this region. It's entirely behind what used to be the Iron Curtain, which means that access to Soviet documentation, communist documentation, was not only necessary for understanding the Soviet Union and Soviet crimes, it also means that from many points of view, it was necessary for understanding the Holocaust itself. If you were concerned about the victims and where they lived, if you were concerned about microhistory, if you were concerned about experience, but also, in my view, if you were concerned about causation, documents from East European and Soviet archives were very important. So there's a certain opportunity there, which I guess I'm trying to say hasn't really been seized to the extent that it might have been. And when it comes to the Soviet historians, the basic problem, and of course I'm simplifying a lot, but the basic problem is that they tend to see things from the point of view of Moscow. So there are important arguments about Soviet terror. Did it come from below? Did it come from above? We now know that it really came from above. But these arguments tend to overlook a certain bloody geography. Soviet terror of all kinds, we now know, tended to strike around the periphery of the Soviet Union. The Asian periphery, the Central Asian periphery, but also this East European periphery. In other words, the same area that I'm calling the Bloodlands. And it's that geography which I'm trying to take into account.
I wanted to jump right in on the issue of comparisons, because I think that for those who are concerned about your undertaking, the notion of comparing the Holocaust or comparing Nazi crimes to Stalinist crimes is troublesome. And I wonder if you could just comment on the whole concept of comparison.
Right. Let me take a step back even from that. It's very often the case that if you try to write a history of Eastern Europe, people say, well, you're writing about a place where both the Soviets and the Germans were, therefore you must be comparing them. And if you're comparing them, therefore you must be equating them. And therefore you, Professor Snyder, must be a very bad person indeed. The reality, I think, demands that we be a bit more subtle for a couple of reasons. One of them is, and again, I'm finding this map extremely helpful. If you think of the map as a place where Jews and others actually lived, and if you remember that the Holocaust took place entirely on terrains that were touched by both German and Soviet power, something will occur to you about comparison, which occurred to me after reading just the first few dozen of what were going to be thousands of Jewish testimony materials. That is that comparison was inherent to the life experience of the people of these terrains. Everyone compared all the time, not just Jews, but Belarusians and Poles and Ukrainians and Russians and everybody who lived here. And the reason they compared was that they were touched by both systems. Everyone who survived the Holocaust and remained in Eastern Europe had some experience of communism. Everybody who lived in Poland in 1939, which is the largest population of Jews in the world, of course, lived in a country that was invaded by the Red Army and the Wehrmacht simultaneously. They had to decide which way were they going to run, if either. To take another example, everybody who was starved in Soviet Ukraine in 1933, which includes, by the way, not just Ukrainians, but Russians and Jews and Poles and Germans and other people, everybody who survived that and then found themselves in a German prisoner of war camp in 1941, compared the two experiences of political starvation. They had to. Some of them wrote poetry about it. Some of them wrote songs about it. It was natural for people to compare because of their own experiences. And it was more than natural. It was obvious because often strategies of trying to survive depended upon the comparison that you made. If you just think of the simple idea of coming out of hiding when the Red Army arrives, that is, of course, a comparative judgment. So these people were condemned to compare. And the whole business of saying that comparing is somehow some sort of intellectual sin strikes me as an East Europeanist who is concerned with East European peoples, among them the Jews, as being inherently quite strange, because comparison is just a historical reality. The second thing I'd want to say about comparison is that it oughtn't to be true that as soon as you write about these two systems, everyone should think that immediately what you're doing is comparing them. I was actually, and I remain fundamentally not that interested in comparing per se, and here's why. Since
1945, or actually earlier, since the Popular Front of the 1930s, there's been a preoccupation with comparing these two systems. A preoccupation which was actually very often driven by the two systems themselves, which insisted that they were very different. And then you have people from the totalitarian school like Hannah Arendt who say, no, in some sense they're fundamentally the same. The problem with all of this is that these comparisons take the two systems apart. They say the Soviets are here and the Germans are here. We're going to say they're alike. We're going to say they're different. Whereas what really interested me was the actual unfolding of policies on territory. And what I found is that the worst places to be were the places where both German and Soviet power were present, which is perhaps not a surprising finding. But if you just compare the two, it's not a finding you can actually get to. So I end up issuing lots of comparative judgments, but my point in this book was really not to compare. Okay, and if you'll permit me, I'm going to say a third thing about comparison, okay, and I'll be done. And that is the question of comparing things to the Holocaust, which I alluded to. And here's what I think about that. What I think about that is that it's absolutely natural and unavoidable that people will compare other things to the Holocaust. An awful lot of bad things happened in the 20th century, and one cannot, by fiat, one cannot demand that people not compare them to the Holocaust. I think then, given that we're in a world in which comparison is natural both in the 1930s and 40s and today, one ought to be in a position to make the comparisons. And to be in a position to make the comparisons, one has to have the history of not just the Holocaust, but other German crimes. And not just German crimes, but Soviet crimes that took place on the same territory. When you have that, you're in a position to say what was unprecedented, what was different about the Holocaust, which is where I come down. I think that the Holocaust was different and it was unprecedented, and I'm confident about that. I think, unlike some of my colleagues who are Holocaust historians, I'm confident about that because I've actually researched all these other things. And I see where they intersect, and I see where they're different, and I see where they overlap, and I see where they don't overlap. And when you make these, and when you put it all into one picture, you notice some interesting things. I'm just going to make one more remark. That Holocaust historians generally say, on the one hand, we know that the Soviets killed more people, but the Holocaust was special because it was directed at one particular people defined by race. Only half of that statement is true, and it's the second half. The first half, which basically every historian of the Holocaust believes, that the Soviets killed more people than the Germans, is simply not true. The Germans actually killed more people than the Soviets did. And this is something which we now have some clarity about. But if you only work on the Holocaust, you will not learn that, and you will continue to repeat the things which you vaguely heard secondhand from colleagues in other fields.